You meet someone new. Something about them feels instantly familiar, even though you have never met before. It feels like chemistry. It feels like fate. But the real reason you feel that pull is far stranger and far older than either of those words suggest. In many cases, that spark of instant familiarity is not a sign you have found the right person. It is a sign your brain has found someone who matches a pattern laid down decades before you ever swiped, dated, or fell in love at all. Almost everyone has a story like this. A relationship that, in hindsight, made no logical sense and yet felt more consuming, more undeniable than any calm, easy connection ever did. Friends may have voiced concern, red flags may have been visible from the outside, and still, something about that particular person felt like it mattered more than reason could explain. That gap between what a relationship looks like from the outside and what it feels like from the inside is exactly where this story begins. Start with a simple observation. Ask anyone to describe their type, and they will usually list surface traits: a certain sense of humor, a particular look, a shared interest. But researchers who study attachment and relationships have found something more unsettling underneath those preferences. The pull you feel towards certain people often has less to do with who is good for you, and more to do with who feels recognizable based on relationships you formed before you could even talk. In the 1950s, the psychiatrist John Bowlby began developing what became known as attachment theory. Bowlby's core idea was that the emotional bond an infant forms with a primary caregiver creates a template, a kind of internal working model for what relationships are supposed to feel like. If that early caregiving was warm, consistent, and responsive, the child tends to develop what researchers call secure attachment, an expectation that closeness is safe and reliable. But if the early caregiving was inconsistent, distant, or unpredictable, the child can develop what is known as anxious or avoidant attachment, an expectation that closeness is uncertain and love has to be earned, chased, or protected against. What makes Bowlby's framework so useful is that it was never really about blame. An infant does not choose the quality of care they receive, and a caregiver's inconsistency is often shaped by their own history, their own stress, their own unmet needs stretching back generations. Bowlby was less interested in assigning fault than in tracing a mechanism, a way of explaining why certain emotional patterns seem to echo forward through a life, showing up decades later in contexts that, on the surface, have nothing to do with childhood at all. A boardroom negotiation, a friendship, and above all, a romantic relationship can all activate the same underlying template, because the nervous system does not neatly separate the context. It simply recognizes a familiar emotional shape and responds the way it learned to respond long ago. Here is the part that reframes everything about adult relationships. That early template does not disappear once you grow up. It becomes the invisible blueprint your nervous system uses to evaluate new relationships, often decades later. The psychologist Mary Ainsworth, working alongside Bowlby, ran a landmark study in the 1970s known as the strange situation, observing how toddlers reacted when separated from and then reunited with their caregiver. What she found was that children with inconsistent early caregiving often showed a specific, almost paradoxical pattern upon reunion. They wanted closeness intensely and simultaneously resisted it, clinging and pushing away at nearly the same moment. Decades of follow-up research have since found strikingly similar patterns in how adults behave in romantic relationships. The specific push and pull that feels so achingly familiar in a difficult relationship is often not new information about your compatibility. It is old information about your earliest bonds, replaying itself on a new stage. Ainsworth's classifications went further than a simple secure versus insecure divide. She identified distinct subtypes: anxious ambivalent children who craved closeness but could not fully trust it once offered, and avoidant children who learned, often because seeking comfort had previously gone unanswered, to suppress the very instinct to seek closeness at all, appearing calm on the surface while their physiological stress responses, measured later by researchers using heart rate monitors, told a very different story underneath. The avoidant child was not actually unaffected by the separation. Their body registered the same alarm as every other child. They had simply learned at an age before language that showing it did not help. Carried into adulthood, this can look like a partner who seems remarkably unbothered by conflict or distance, not because they truly are, but because some far earlier version of them concluded that visible need was pointless. This explains something that puzzles a lot of people about their own romantic history. Why does a calm, emotionally available partner sometimes feel boring or even slightly suspicious, while an unpredictable, harder-to-read partner can feel intensely magnetic? If your early template was built around consistency, calm partners feel like home, because that is what home was supposed to feel like. But if your early template was built around inconsistency, then calm can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling, precisely because your nervous system was never taught to recognize steady affection as safe. Uncertainty, ironically, can feel more like love, simply because uncertainty is what your brain learned to associate with connection in the first place. This is not simply a matter of taste, the way someone might prefer one cuisine over another. Researchers who study adult attachment describe it as a kind of confirmation bias built directly into the nervous system. A person with an anxious attachment history tends to interpret ambiguous behavior from a partner, a delayed reply, a distracted mood, a cancelled plan, as evidence that they need to work harder to secure the relationship, which paradoxically deepens the emotional investment rather than weakening it. Meanwhile, that same person can interpret a partner's consistent warmth as somehow less meaningful, precisely because it requires no vigilance, no chase, no proof of worth. The nervous system, in effect, has learned to mistake anxiety for depth of feeling and calm for a lack of one, which is exactly backward from how healthy attachment is supposed to function. There is a neurological layer to this as well, one that helps explain why the pull toward a familiar but difficult pattern can feel less like a choice and more like a compulsion. The anthropologist Helen Fisher spent years studying the brains of people who reported being intensely in love, using functional MRI scans to observe what was actually happening beneath the surface. Her research found that early-stage romantic attraction activates regions of the brain associated with reward and motivation, the same basic circuitry involved in substance dependence. Fisher's scans showed particularly strong activity when a relationship involved uncertainty or obstacles, rejection, distance, unpredictability, rather than steady security. In other words, the brain's reward system does not simply respond to love. It responds especially strongly to love that is difficult to fully secure. The chase itself becomes part of the chemical reward, which helps explain why some people report feeling most alive, most consumed, most certain that something is love, precisely when a relationship is the least stable. Fisher's work also found that this reward activity did not fade evenly for everyone. In participants who had recently been rejected by a partner, the scans showed activity in reward-related regions that was, if anything, more intense than in participants happily in a relationship, alongside activity in regions associated with craving and physical pain. The brain, in a very literal sense, treated the loss of an uncertain, hard-won connection the way it might treat withdrawal from a substance, which is part of why heartbreak over an unstable relationship can feel disproportionately devastating compared to heartbreak over a relationship that was calm and secure the whole way through. It is not that the unstable relationship mattered more. It is that the neurochemical investment required to sustain it in the first place was simply larger. Put these findings together, and a difficult pattern starts to make sense. A person raised with inconsistent affection develops a nervous system tuned to associate uncertainty with connection. That same person meets someone whose unpredictability activates a powerful dopamine-driven reward response, remarkably similar to the neural signature of addiction. The result feels, subjectively, like the strongest, most undeniable attraction of their life. But what is actually happening is two old systems, one emotional and one neurochemical, recognizing a familiar shape and mistaking that recognition for rightness. This does not mean two damaged people are doomed to repeat the same mistake forever, and it does not mean every intense attraction is a red flag. Plenty of secure people feel strong, healthy passion for partners who are equally secure. But it does mean that intensity itself is not proof of compatibility. The fact that someone feels like they were made for you can sometimes mean exactly that. Other times, it can mean your nervous system has simply found someone who speaks the same old, familiar emotional language it learned before you had any say in the matter. It is also worth saying that attachment patterns, unlike a fixed trait, are not a life sentence. Researchers who study this area over time have found that what they call earned secure attachment is possible, meaning someone who started out anxious or avoidant can, often through a combination of self-awareness, therapy, and enough repeated experience with genuinely reliable relationships, gradually build a new template alongside the old one. The old wiring does not vanish completely, but it stops being the only voice in the room. This matters because it means the pull toward a familiar but painful pattern is not a permanent verdict on anyone's capacity for a healthy relationship. It is simply the starting point, shaped by circumstances no one chose, that can shift with enough deliberate, patient work. Understanding this changes what falling in love can mean going forward. The question worth asking is not simply, does this feel intense? It is, does this intensity come from feeling safe, or does it come from feeling uncertain? Real security often feels quieter than people expect. It can even feel at first a little unfamiliar, especially to someone whose nervous system was trained early to equate love with a kind of vigilant, anxious effort. That unfamiliarity is not proof that something is wrong. Sometimes it is proof that something, for once, is finally right. So the next time you meet someone and feel that instant, overwhelming sense of familiarity, that feeling like you already know them, you will not need to call it fate. You will know exactly what you are recognizing. Not necessarily the right person. Sometimes just the oldest, most familiar shape your heart has ever learned to reach for.